The rumble of the earth, trembling beneath the feet, and the hoarse roaring of animals that ancient authors compared to thunder. This is how Polybius described the moment when war elephants appeared on the battlefield. These living walls of flesh and bone seemed invincible, weighing up to 5 tons, with tusks clad in iron and towers on their backs in which warriors sat. For many soldiers, this was the first and last spectacle of their lives. And yet, the Roman legions, with their iron discipline, found a way to turn this nightmare into a weapon against the elephants themselves. But exactly how they managed to cope with the living tanks of antiquity, you will learn about this further. The Romans first encountered this monstrous weapon during the Pyrrhic Wars at the beginning of the 3rd century BC. When King Pyrrhus of Epirus landed in Italy, he brought with him 20 war elephants. Livy wrote that the Romans had never before seen such creatures. For the legionaries, it was like the sudden appearance of monsters from myths. In the battle at Heraclea, many Roman horses panicked and fled from the smell and screaming of the animals, and the ranks of legionaries staggered under the onslaught of this enormous living mass. These monstrous creatures the Romans called by the word luxa, not as a specific term but as the embodiment of weight, overwhelming force. But in ancient sources there is also a precise definition. Such war animals were called elephanti bellatores, war elephants. And unlike ordinary weapons, these monsters combined living fury and the cold calculation of commanders. Imagine the picture: an infantryman armed with a spear weighing 2 kilograms and an oval shield nearly as tall as himself had to meet on the battlefield an animal that weighed 1,000 times more than him. An elephant could ram through a formation, scatter people, breaking bones, and continue moving as if it had merely run into reeds. This was a living catastrophe for anyone who stood in its path, but it was precisely this challenge that became the beginning of a new stage of military thought. The Romans were not a people who surrendered before fear. Every blow of fate they turned into a lesson, and already then, under the weight of the giant steps, a system began to be born that in the future would allow them to destroy the living tanks with frightening precision. And yet, before learning to defeat elephants, the legionaries had to understand what exactly made them so deadly dangerous on the battlefield. The Romans learned from their own experience. The strength of elephants was not only in their mass. These beasts broke formations no worse than a battering ram, but the main weapon turned out to be terror, paralyzing even hardened warriors. Polybius wrote that in the first encounters, the horses of the Roman cavalry fell into panic from the smell and trumpet cry of the animals, and the legionaries themselves lost confidence. The squealing, roaring, and cracking of broken spears merged into one continuous noise that even before the strike turned battle order into chaos. That is precisely why commanders like Pyrrhus or later Hannibal used elephants as a weapon of shock, designed to crush the enemy's moral resistance. To cope with this weapon, the Romans had to prepare their troops differently than before. The main emphasis was placed on discipline. Where other armies lost formation, the Romans held in tight order. But discipline by itself was only the foundation. New methods were needed. Already at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, special units appeared that were tasked with meeting the attack of elephants. Soldiers were trained not to flee, but to create corridors. When an animal rushed forward, the ranks parted, letting it through the formation, after which the legionaries struck the monster from the flanks. It was precisely such maneuvers that became possible thanks to the special structure of the legion, the manipular system. To understand its essence, imagine a sports team divided not into one large field, but into dozens of small groups, each of which knows how to act independently. These groups were called manipules. A manipule is a formation of approximately 120 men, capable of changing formation, opening and closing ranks. This flexibility allowed the Romans not to fear the living battering rams and turn their onslaught into a trap. But flexibility cost effort. Archaeological data shows that the average legionary carried 25 to 30 kilograms of equipment: shield, armor, weapons, food supply, and tools for camp. He had to be not just a fighter, but an enduring builder and carrier. Modern researchers compare such a load to marathon runners running with a backpack. Warriors covered 20 kilometers per day and then had to dig a ditch, put up fortifications and be ready for battle. This steely habit of heavy marches and labor turned them into a mechanism capable of withstanding encounters even with monsters. Special attention was paid to signals. In ancient battle, the noise was such that voice commands were lost. It was then that trumpets, tuba, played a key role. This is not just a musical instrument, but a system of commands. By the sound of the trumpet, legionaries knew when to part ranks, when to close shields, and when to go on the attack. For a viewer, this may seem like something akin to a modern referee's whistle in football, but on the battlefield, the right signal decided the fate of hundreds of lives. And here appears another feature of the Roman army: clear hierarchy. Mid-level commanders, centurions, bore responsibility for each section of the formation. They knew their men by name, and the soldiers knew that it was precisely this officer who would lead them into battle. A centurion was not only a commander, but also an example. His special sign, a staff of vine wood, a symbol of discipline. If an ordinary soldier began to panic, the centurion was obliged to restore order, even at the cost of his own life. It was precisely thanks to such people that the army could react cohesively to an elephant attack. But no training was complete without fear. Sources emphasize, in the first encounters, soldiers still trembled. An elephant that burst into the formation could lift a legionary with its trunk and hurl him aside, trample a dozen at once. This was the embodiment of chaos. And yet, in this situation the main principle of Roman warfare is born. If a monster is too large to fight face to face, it is necessary to turn its strength into weakness. The tactic of letting through and striking from the flanks gradually becomes established as the norm. Years later, this same logic will lead to the creation of even more sophisticated techniques. For example, to the use of special spearmen who waited specifically for elephants. The legionaries realized fear can be overcome only through experience, and it was precisely practice, the blood lost in the first battles with Pyrrhus, that hardened the army so much that they could meet a new threat, far more terrible than the Epirot monsters. For ahead of them lay the Punic Wars and Carthage, where elephants would become an even more formidable weapon. When the Romans first encountered the elephants of Pyrrhus, it was only a preface to far more terrible trials. The real encounter with living tanks occurred during the Punic Wars against Carthage. The city, rich in trade and naval power, possessed the resources to maintain dozens of war elephants. These animals the Carthaginians obtained in North Africa, in areas where smaller but still terrifying African forest elephants still lived. For the Romans, who were accustomed to fighting people, not monsters, each appearance of such a beast on the battlefield was like a thunderclap on a clear day. One of the most striking encounters occurred in the battle at Tunis in 255 BC during the First Punic War. Polybius describes how more than 100 elephants lined up before the Carthaginian army and moved directly at the Roman legions. Imagine the picture: a wide field, dust raised by hoofs and the feet of animals, the clang of metal and the shouts of commanders, and on the horizon, a line of dark giants that slowly but inexorably move forward, breaking everything in their path. For soldiers standing in the front ranks, this was not just a threat, it was the shadow of death approaching every second. Here, the strength of the Roman structure manifested itself. The ranks of legionaries began to part like gates, letting the monsters inside. But this was not chaos, but a previously worked out maneuver. The soldiers knew an elephant cannot stop abruptly. Its mass makes it inertial, like a heavy cart released down a mountain. And it was precisely this inertia that the Romans turned into a weapon against the enemy. When the animal passed by, spears and javelins plunged into its sides, and archers and slingers struck at the eyes and trunk. Thus the animal lost control and began to rage, often turning against its own Carthaginian masters. To strengthen this effect, the Romans used special weapons, long spears with sharpened iron tips. Such spearmen were called hastati, heavy infantrymen of the first lines, but it is important not to confuse. Their role was not limited only to meeting elephants, they were a universal combat unit.
However, it was precisely their shields and spears that often became the barrier that had to delay the onslaught at least for a moment, so that the maniples could have time to regroup. One of the most unusual details that Appian describes was the use of special traps. The Romans dug pits and disguised them with grass or branches. When an elephant ran forward, it fell through and broke its legs. Of course, this did not always work, and many historians doubt the scale of such techniques, but the fact remains. The Romans sought any ways to deprive the enemy of its monstrous advantage. But the main lesson they learned in these battles was not only in tactics, but also in psychology. The warriors were taught that the beast is just an animal controlled by a man. If you kill the driver, called a mahout, the elephant turned into a dangerous but disorderly beast. This technique became the key to many victories. Archers and javelin throwers aimed primarily at the drivers. Without control, the animal often turned around and rushed back, sweeping away its own ranks. Sources mention that the Carthaginians tried to protect their drivers with armor and even built special towers for archers on the backs of animals, but this only increased the weight and made the elephants less maneuverable. Here the Roman ability to look for weaknesses manifested itself. The more the enemy fortified the beast, the easier it was to predict its behavior. All this became obvious in the decisive battle at Zama in 202 BC, when the troops of Scipio Africanus met the army of Hannibal. There the Romans already consciously prepared the ranks so as to form corridors through which the elephants passed through the legion without causing damage. This moment became the culmination of Roman adaptation, from the first defeats and fear to complete control of the situation. But the outcome of Zama itself deserves a separate story, because it was there that the fate not only of the army, but also of the future of the Mediterranean was decided. The battle at Zama in 202 BC became the moment when the Romans finally proved their discipline is capable of surpassing even the most formidable force of the ancient world. On both sides converged the armies of the greatest commanders of the era, Hannibal and Scipio Africanus. Carthage brought onto the field about 80 war elephants, which were lined up in front of the entire army. The rumble and roar of animals resembled an earthquake. Polybius wrote that the earth trembled under their steps, and the soldiers themselves, even those who had seen dozens of battles, felt themselves facing not just an enemy, but the elements. But it was precisely here that Roman cunning manifested itself. Scipio knew, if you hold the formation and do not succumb to panic, then the huge animals will turn into a vulnerable force. He ordered his maniples to form up in an unusual way, not in a dense line, but with wide gaps between units. In these corridors the legionaries stood in rows, ready to strike, but left space where the elephants were supposed to rush. This tactic had a simple but brilliant essence. The mass of the animal became useless if it was not opposed by a solid wall. An elephant that rushed into emptiness lost its target and found itself isolated. Of special significance was the role of velites, light infantry armed with javelins. These warriors, positioned in front, pelted the animals with throwing spears, aiming at the eyes and ears. Appian noted that many elephants already in the first minutes of battle lost control, reared up and turned back, crashing into the Carthaginian cavalry. Thus, the weapon intended to crush the Romans turned into a source of chaos for the Carthaginians themselves. Visually, it looked like this. The Roman formation seemed to dissolve before the onslaught of monsters, and then, like a trap, closed behind their backs. Soldiers located on the sides of the corridors struck with spears and swords, archers released arrows, and trumpets sounded signals for regroupings. Each step was worked out in advance. The legion represented a living mechanism where each person performed his role in the overall scheme. The term that best describes this structure is ordo, that is, order. For the Romans, this was not just a word, but a principle of life. Order in camp, order on the march, order in battle. Even in the face of panic, when a giant with a tower on its back broke the ground with its feet, it was precisely ordo that allowed a soldier not to flee, but to wait for a command. Modern historians, like Godsworthy, emphasize that it was precisely in this that lay the main difference between Rome and other armies of antiquity, their ability to maintain order where others saw only chaos. The fighters themselves felt this physically. Archaeological finds show that their shields, scutums, weighed about 10 kilograms and swords, gladiuses, about 1 kilogram. Holding such mass in their hands for hours, the legionaries became accustomed to the load and could act without fuss. When an elephant broke through inside, a soldier gripped his shield and waited for the moment to strike with a shot gladius from the side. This technique was simple but deadly, because an animal wounded in the side or stomach began to thrash about, causing damage to its own ranks. A special place in this battle was occupied by cavalry. Scipio had previously agreed with the Numidian ally Massinissa, whose light cavalry was supposed to strike at the flanks. But for the cavalry to have time to enter the battle, the elephants had to be neutralized, and it was precisely this that the maniples did. As a result, when the first waves of animals were either killed or put to flight, the Roman cavalry was able to close the ring and defeat the Carthaginians definitively. According to the testimonies of ancient historians, Carthage's losses were horrifying, up to 20,000 killed and as many captured. By comparison, the Romans lost about 1,500 men. The contrast is colossal. The terrible weapon on which Hannibal had bet turned out to be practically useless. It was precisely after Zama that elephants gradually lose significance as a decisive factor of war. The Romans proved that discipline and order can surpass mass and fear. But the animals did not disappear from battlefields instantly. In subsequent decades, they were still used by Rome's opponents, but their effect became weaker and weaker. From this moment on, the Romans no longer perceived living tanks as monsters, but rather as a predictable element of tactics that could be turned against the enemy. But what became of the very image of the elephant in Roman culture, and how it turned from a terrifying weapon into a symbol of victory, it is precisely this that will become the next stage of our story. After Zama, the Romans stopped seeing elephants as mythical monsters. Now these were just animals that could serve as decoration for a triumph, but not turn the tide of battle. And yet, in subsequent decades, they had to encounter this weapon again and again, especially in wars in the East. When Rome began to expand in Greece and Asia Minor, it again saw on the battlefield formidable beasts that the kings of Hellenistic states displayed as a symbol of power. One such encounter was the battle at Magnesia in 191 BC against the Seleucid state. Polybius describes in detail how Antiochus Tsushite brought onto the field 54 elephants, arranged along the front. This was more than Hannibal had at Zama, and the impression should have been stunning. The rumble, squealing, clouds of dust, all this pressed on the psyche of soldiers even before the beasts moved forward. But the experience of the Romans did its work. They already knew. The main thing is to hold the formation and remember the order. When the animals went on the attack, the legionaries again used the tactic of corridors, and the velites pelted them with javelins. In some cases, as Livy notes, the elephants simply did not dare to go at the formation of spearmen, and, sensing blood and noise, turned back. This effect once again confirmed, the strength of the beast turned against its masters. It is interesting that it was precisely after Magnesia that the Romans finally established in their military doctrine the idea: an elephant is not an invincible monster, but a tool that can be deprived of meaning by correct tactics. Moreover, they began to use animals for decorative purposes. During triumphs in Rome, elephants began to appear as part of the procession, demonstrating the greatness of the victor. But on the battlefield, their role gradually faded to nothing. The most important term that helps understand this era is triumphus. This is not just a military parade, but a ritual in which the entire army and the commander himself showed the city and the gods their victory. And it was precisely in such processions that elephants became a symbol not of terror, but of a conquered beast. They walked through the streets of Rome not as the enemy's weapon, but as spoils, emphasizing the superiority of the legions. Archaeological finds confirm this shift in perception. On Roman coins of the 2nd century BC, elephants are depicted next to the chariots of triumphators. On reliefs, they appear as part of processions, not battles. This shows how quickly the symbol changed its meaning, from the embodiment of terror to a sign of victory. But even in this new role, the beasts remained dangerous. It is known that when transporting and maintaining elephants, the Romans faced enormous difficulties. One elephant could eat up to 200 kilograms of grass and tens of liters of water per day. For an army that was accustomed to strict ration norms, approximately 1 kilogram of grain per person per day, such expenses seemed unthinkable. To maintain an entire herd on the march was a logistical nightmare. It was precisely for this reason that the Romans preferred to use animals only for symbolic purposes and not as a regular part of the army. However, it cannot be said that elephants disappeared instantly. In battles, in Africa and in the East, even in the 1st century BC, individual encounters with war animals are mentioned. Caesar, for example, in his commentaries, describes how in North Africa his legions encountered several elephants of opponents. And again, discipline and order allowed them not only to hold out, but also to put the enemy's animals to flight. Thus, over the course of 2 centuries, the elephant, from a terrifying weapon, turned into a useless burden. But in the memory of the Romans it remained a symbol of that fear which can be overcome, and of that force which seemed beyond human. And most importantly, an example of how reason and discipline are capable of defeating even the elements. It was precisely this realization that prepared the Romans for the next step, the transformation of fear before monsters into confidence in their own invincibility. But the question remained open. If they were able to tame even living tanks, then what threat could stop Rome? When we speak of the confrontation between the Romans and war elephants, it is important to remember this was not only a struggle on battlefields, but also a clash of 2 worldviews. For Eastern and African kingdoms, the elephant symbolized greatness, power, connection with the gods. For Rome, however, it became the embodiment of chaos that can be defeated only by order and discipline, and it was precisely this confrontation that created the legend of legions capable of withstanding everything. Historians note that the Roman army after the Second Punic War finally rebuilt its thinking. Elephants became for them a kind of examination. They proved there is no enemy who cannot be studied, adapted to, and defeated. This principle became the foundation of the Roman military machine, which then conquered almost the entire known world. The same logic, the transformation of fear into strength, was used in future wars as well. That is precisely why, even centuries later, when in North Africa or in the East, war elephants were still brought out, the Romans no longer perceived them as a threat, and yet the memory of the first battles remained. Plutarch wrote that old veterans of the Pyrrhic Wars spoke of the beasts with trembling in their voices, as if recalling a meeting with Hades himself. This experience was not only military, but also cultural. Elephants became part of Roman mythology about their own superiority. We defeated not only people, but also monsters. The term that best reflects this transition is virtus. For the Romans, this was more than valor. Virtus meant courage, the ability to stand one's ground even in the face of death. And it was precisely victories over elephants that turned into proof of this valor. A soldier who could withstand the onslaught of a 5-ton beast felt that he was capable of withstanding everything. In archaeological finds, we see how this symbolism became established. On mosaics and reliefs of later times, elephants appear not as enemies, but as decorations of triumphal scenes. They become part of the Roman narrative about the victory of civilization over chaos. Even in the Colosseum, during spectacles, elephants were used, but no longer as a weapon, but as part of theatrical performances. Thus, the enemy turned into a trophy. And yet it is worth noting, historians still debate how effective the use of war elephants was in general. Polybius and Appian describe cases when they caused panic and broke formations, but just as often the beasts turned against their own masters. Modern researchers such as Keegan or Goldsworthy emphasize the elephant was a psychological weapon, not a strategic one. Its strength acted in the first minutes of battle, but against a disciplined army it turned into a danger for the owner himself. And here arises the main question. If the Romans were able to turn living tanks into useless cargo, what does this say about human nature? Is it not in this that the greatest secret of history is hidden, the ability of man to adapt to the most terrible? Roman legionaries carried 30 kilograms of equipment on themselves, marched 20 kilometers per day, dug fortifications every evening, and yet found the strength to withstand the onslaught of monsters. They were not superhumans. These were ordinary peasants and craftsmen whom discipline and order turned into a steel mechanism. And it is precisely in this that lies the main lesson of history. Not mass, not fear, but reason and endurance decide the outcome of battle. The elephant, which seemed invincible, became a symbol of defeated force, and the legionary, armed with a short sword and iron will, a symbol of human victory over chaos. And now, when you know this story, ask yourself the question: if an ordinary man in iron armor could stand against 5 tons of fury and destruction, then what are we, modern people, capable of withstanding in the face of our own trials? For in each of us there is that very virtus that once allowed Rome to defeat even the living tanks of the ancient world.